this question. How many of you, now let me ask you this way. Is anybody willing to share what is one of your favorite TV talent shows, right? There's all kinds of singing shows, cooking shows, all kinds of different talent shows. Anybody, what's one of the favorite ones you watch? Anybody? No, everybody's afraid to say what they watch on TV. Who likes America's Got Talent? Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one, right? How about, this one isn't like with judges, though, the Little Big Shots. You guys ever seen that one? Little Big Shots, then little kids come out and do something really cool. Right? There's a lot of them. And here's the amazing thing is, they're one of the most popular things on television, not only in America, but all over the world. And you may not realize this, but as long as we've had TV talent shows. I mean, the first one was back in 1948. There was a show at that time called The Original Amateur Hour. You may know The Original Amateur Hour. A few of you familiar with that one. And even it was on TV for years. Before that, it was on radio for years. Because we like to see people's talent on display. We're impressed to see, wow, what can that person do? What talents does that person have? But you may not realize that the way we use the word talent actually comes from the Bible. The way we use the word talent kind of to mean what you can do with what you have, right? That's a talent. What you can do with what you have. That came from the parable that we're going to look at this morning. I want to invite you there to Matthew 25, starting in verse 14. And it's called the parable of the talents. And you'll see, before this parable was told by Jesus, a parable meant what it means here. Not what it, now we use it kind of like for what it symbolizes. But at this time it was told meaning what its literal meaning was. A talent, first of all, a talent was a weight, a certain weight of measure. How heavy was something? Well, it's a talent. It weighs a talent. It came to mean a certain measure of money, right? We talked about that last week a little bit, that 1 talent of money, a talent was about the income that you could make. If you worked for 20 years, you would earn a talent. So even though it sounds small because it's 1, a talent was a pretty big deal, what you received there. But Jesus told this story to remind us that what we have is really what's been entrusted to us. Any talent we have, any ability we have, any gift, skill, or opportunity we have is really something that's been entrusted to us. It's not something we've earned on our own. It may be something that we've developed, but it's something that's been entrusted to us. And anything that's been entrusted to us, there's a certain level of responsibility with that, right? And we call that stewardship. Right? We call that stewardship. Now I gotta be careful because as soon as you say stewardship, everybody thinks of money, right? Stewardship, that's money. It's kind of like when we Baptists especially, when we Baptists talk about fellowship, we're talking about food, right? Food, fellowship actually means more than food. You may be surprised to realize that. And stewardship means a lot more than money. Stewardship means realizing that everything that it includes money, but our time, our gifts, our talents, our opportunities, everything we have is something that's been entrusted to us. And so we need to be good stewards of what has been entrusted to us. So let's go ahead and read this parable, starting in Matthew 25, in verse 14. Jesus says, "For it will be like a man," and let me, I know I just started, but where it says it, what is it? It refers way back to verse 1, talking about the kingdom of heaven. Jesus is telling different stories about the kingdom of heaven, what that will be like, what that looks like. So when he says, "For it will be," he's talking about the kingdom of heaven will be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his ability. And then he went away. And he who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them. And he made 5 talents more, right? He went into business, used that money to make more money. In verse 17 it says, "So also he who had the 2 talents," I'm sorry, I lost my place. "He who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, and saying, 'Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I have made 5 talents more.' And his master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master.' He also who had the 2 talents came forward, saying, 'Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master.' And he also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid. And I went and I hid your talent in the ground, and here, you have what is yours. But his master answered him, saying, You wicked and slothful servant. I love that word, slothful. Isn't that great? You could have just said lazy, but I love he says, you're like a sloth. You are slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown, and gather where I scattered no seed. And there's a question mark after that. So he's not agreeing with the premise. He's saying, well, that's how you think of me? Well, in that case, verse 27, then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers. And at my coming, I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So we learn from this story how important it is for us to stretch our stewardship, to make the most of the things that have been entrusted to us by our master. So let's look at a few key ideas here that I think will help us stay focused on them. Focused on who's really in charge, who's really in control, and what we should really be doing with all the things, the talents that have been entrusted to us. All right? The first key idea is this. God entrusts us with an individual stewardship. God entrusts us with an individual stewardship. Notice the master gave each servant a different level of responsibility. And I think for us, again, I think especially in English, and with the word talent and the numbers 1, 2, 5, we go 1, 2, 5 all look pretty small to us, right? So it doesn't really seem to be a big deal. But again, I want to remind you again, 1 talent was 20 years' wages. So going from 1 talent to 2 talents was a pretty big leap. Going from 2 talents to 5 talents was incomprehensible. I mean, that was so much more than he had to deal with. So there really is such a disparity of what people have been given. And have you noticed, God has not given us all the same stewardship. Not only has God, he's given us different gifts and abilities and opportunities, but he's also given, let's be honest, God's given us, some of us more, and some of us less. God has given some people more abilities, more opportunities, more giftedness, and some people don't have as much. That's just the way it is. God gave some 1 and some 2 and some 5. So what do we do with that? I think we need to remember as God's stewards, God has given you the exact amount of his property. And remember at the beginning, it says this is all his property. God has entrusted to you the exact amount of his property that he wants you to take care of. And so I think we need to think through that and be a little bit careful with it, because I think sometimes if we're a person with more, right? Maybe you're a person that you have more gifts and abilities. You have more opportunities than other people. And for one thing, sometimes that can lead to pride. It can lead to a person saying, well, look what I can do and they can't do that. Look what I have and they don't have that. Look at what I have to work with and look what they have to work with. And it can lead to pride, but guard against that. In those areas where you are a high talent individual, guard yourself against pride, because everything you have has been entrusted to you. Everything that you have isn't because you are just a genius of a person, right? I don't mean to be insulting, but sometimes if we have a lot to work with, we go, well, look at me. And God says, no. That means you have more to work with for me. The second thing I think we have to guard against is if you have more gifts, talents, opportunities, abilities, make sure that doesn't cause you to slack off, right? Have you ever noticed sometimes kids in school, some kids have a really hard time and they work really hard, and if they work hard enough, maybe they get a B-. And other kids go, man, I didn't have to work at all and I got an A. Being more talented, having more abilities doesn't mean you should skate. It doesn't mean you should slack off and say, well, why should I work hard? I don't have to. God has given you that amount of skill and ability and opportunity because he wants you to use it to your full capacity for him. On the other hand, sometimes we're going to feel like a 1 or 2 talent servant, right? Because all of us know people who have more gifts and abilities and opportunities and stuff than we have. And it's easy for one thing to get frustrated with that. To say, well, it's just not even fair. I mean, look at how much they have compared to what I have. Look at what they can do that I can't do. Look at the vacations they can take. I can't take my kids on that. Look at what they can do for their kids that I can't do for my kids. Look at what they can accomplish. Look at the talents they have to work with. And also it can cause us to slack off and say, well, I guess if I could do more, I do more. But look, they can do so much more than me. Why should I even contribute? Isn't it interesting? Either way, the reaction could be to do less, but God, the whole point of this parable is work hard to use what you have to your full capacity. I remember one time I went to a conference at, you guys familiar with Saddleback Church out in California, Rick Warren's church? I went to a conference there one time, and I remember the children's pastor was speaking, and he was talking about all his volunteers. I can't even imagine how many volunteers they have to have in their kids' ministry. But he said, of all my volunteers in my kids' ministry, he goes, you know, there are certain volunteers, he said, I like to call them 100-watt volunteers. They're just amazing. They can teach, they can lead, they can organize, they do great with the kids, they do great with the parents. They're amazing. And he said, it used to be that I would look at the other volunteers and go, you know what, if I just put enough into them, if I lead them well, and I train them well, and I resource them, and if I just pour into them, I can lead everybody to become a 100-watt volunteer. How great will that be? Imagine what we can do when we have all 100-watt volunteers. And he said it was so frustrating because no matter what I did, some people just couldn't get there. And he said, then I realized. He says, you know what? Not everybody's meant to be a 100-watt volunteer. Some people are 75 watters. And no matter how much I teach them, lead them, no matter how much they put into it, that's what they can do. And he said, you know what? I learned that, you know what? The goal is not to make everybody a 100-watter. The goal is to make sure everybody reaches their potential. And I know that's talking about in the area of volunteers, but think about it as it applies to this principle here. Whatever God has entrusted to you, maybe you go, well, I'm a one-talent kind of servant. Maybe you're a two-talent servant, or 3, or 4, or 5, or 10. Whatever God has entrusted to you, use it to your full capacity. That's the idea. God has given you a very individual stewardship, so evaluate yourself. What has He given you? What has He entrusted to you? Are you using what you have to your fullest capability? And maybe you go, well, I'm not a 5-talent. Then don't be a 5-talent. Maybe you're a 2-talent. Be the best 2-talent servant you can be. Maybe you are a 5-talent person. Well, then don't live like a 2-talent person. Live to your full capacity. Don't worry about how you stack up compared to others. Don't worry about what's fair or not fair. Just live up to what God has entrusted to you. Here's the second key thought from this passage. God gives us a limited time to demonstrate our stewardship. God has given us a limited time. Notice in this parable, the master goes on a journey. And obviously in this story, Jesus is describing himself as he's going to be gone for a while. But notice in this story, he comes back, it says, after a long time. We don't know how long that was. But also, it seems to me there's no indication here to these servants when the master's coming back. They don't know when he's coming back. He says, hey, I'm going on a journey. They don't know when he's coming back. They know he's coming back after a long time. Although I have a little suspicion that the third servant, I think part of what was in his, I know this is a pretend story Jesus made up, but I think a little what was in his mind is I'm going to go dig this money, I'm going to put it in a hole because if he doesn't come back, then it's mine, right? I think that's in there a little bit, but that's my opinion. You can take it or leave it. But all of them had a limited time. They didn't know how long they had. They just knew eventually the Lord's coming back, eventually the master's coming back. And I think that's why we see the urgency from the 5-talent servant. Notice there's just 2 little words, but notice them in verse 16. In verse 16, the words that jumped out at me were, at once. At once. As soon as the master left, at once this servant got to work. Why? Because he said, I don't know how long I have. I'm going to work as hard as I can because my master's leaving. He's coming back. I got to get to work at once. It isn't, well, let me take a couple months off and then I'll get to work. It was, I need to get to work at once. Because when my master comes back, I want to make sure I've done everything I can do before my master gets back. Is that how we think? Do we think that way? I hope so. Because we have a master who's gone for a while. We don't know how long he's going to be gone. We don't know when he's coming back, but we know he's coming back. Whether that means he comes back in the rapture and receives us to him at that moment, or whether that just means when my life on this earth is over, one way or another, I have a limited amount of time. This life, it's interesting to me in this passage especially, but other passages in the New Testament as well, it seems like this time that we have on earth is kind of like an internship, right? How many of you ever served in an intern? Who has served as an intern before? Anybody done an internship before? A couple of you. I've been an intern before. When I started out, I was going to Bible college and I had to have an internship. I got an internship with a church. You know, when you're an intern, you work pretty hard. because you want to learn what you can, but it's a weird time because you're learning new things. You don't feel super, at least for me, I didn't feel super confident at first. And hey, we're going to have you teach this class and preach to these people. And I'm like, whoa, wait, slow down. But you only had a limited amount of time. But it wasn't only so you could learn everything you could learn, it was also so you could prove yourself a little bit. Because when your internship was over, you thought, well, maybe if I do a really good job, maybe they'll hire me. Or maybe they'll at least give me a great recommendation to be hired by somebody else. How many of you, let me ask the opposite question. How many of you ever worked with an intern? Anybody ever worked with an intern? Okay, a few more people. I was going to ask you if that's a good experience or not, but I'm not going to ask that question. Because sometimes it is, right? Sometimes it's a great experience. Sometimes it's, man, they came, they contributed so much, they worked so hard, they were great to work with. I feel like I taught them a lot. And I know in my last church, we had multiple interns. Anytime we had a great intern who gave effort and time and heart and work, man, by the end of that, we were trying to we hired people even though we didn't have positions for them sometimes. Because we thought, man, they're just such a quality person. They're such a hard worker. Let's hire them to do something. But we also had the other kind of intern. We had the intern that, man, just, goofed off, never seemed to get things done. You always had to check on everything because they didn't pull it off in time. And it seemed like if the boss left the room, they just, I don't know what they did. Because when the boss came back in the room, they didn't have anything more done. And that reminds me of the third guy. But notice these first two guys. Their thing was, look, he's going to be gone for a little bit of time. I need to accomplish as much as I can before he gets back. Is that what we're doing? Man, I hope so. I hope that you in your life, you're saying, you know what? I only got a certain number of hours on this planet. I only have a certain number of days. Sometimes I know it seems long, right? Sometimes you go, man, life lasts forever. And other times you go, wow, it's flying by. But always we need to remember, we have a limited time. We have a limited stewardship. Let's do well with the time that we have so we're ready for when the master comes back to settle accounts with us. And that kind of leads us to the third thought, which is this. God will reward us for our stewardship. Do we believe that? Do we believe there's really a Lord who's going to come back one day and reward us, either good or bad, for the way we've managed his resources while he's been away? John MacArthur, he said the theme of this parable was the tragedy of wasted opportunity. And I thought, wow, that's a bummer. That's the thing. And I don't think that's all there is. I'm like, wait, let's not jump. I get that's how it ends. But let's not jump all the way back there yet. Let's realize this parable also teaches the joy of a fulfilled opportunity. The fact that those first two servants, and notice what we learn about them. Those first two servants were faithful. Let's celebrate the commendation of faithful servants. They were entrusted with vastly different amounts, right? One had 2 to work with. One had 5 to work with. But both of them worked hard. Both of them were faithful. Both of them doubled what they started with. And both of them came back to the master and received the same verdict. To both of them, the master said, well done, good and faithful servant. Right? You've been faithful over a little bit. I'm going to set you over much. Come into the joy of your master. I mean, what a beautiful thing to hear from the master. And I would like to point out that they were commended not for their success, but for their character. It's interesting to me that the master never says, wow, 5 more, that's great. He doesn't talk about the product they created. He talks about the character they had. He said, while I've been gone, you've been a good servant. You've been faithful. He commends them for their character. Don't you love the promises of God to faithful servants? And we see it peppered throughout the New Testament. I was going to share more with you, but let me just share this one with you. It reminds us of Paul's joy as he looked back on his life and he looked forward into eternity. He's writing to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 6 through 8. And let these words, again, even if they're familiar to you, let these words really sink in. Paul wrote this. He says, I am already being poured out as a drink offering. Already get the visual of that in your head. He's saying my life and all of our lives are this way. All of our lives, they're being poured out on something. All of our lives, when you pour something out, you don't get it back. You pour that water onto the ground, it's gone. He says my life's being poured out. What's his life being poured out for? He said it's being poured out as an offering. My life is being offered to the Lord. It's being poured out on that. And he goes on to say, and the time of my departure has come. Paul, at this time of this writing, he said, you know what? I know it's almost over for me. We don't always get to know that, do we? But for him, he said, I know the time of my departure has come. I mean, it's coming, Timothy. I know this is almost it for me. But as he looked back on his life, look what he could say. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. And Paul, as he writes these words, I don't think he's being braggadocious. I don't think he's being proud or arrogant. Well, look what I did. I don't think that's the idea. I think this is a man at the end of his life who is fulfilled. And he's saying to his protege, Timothy, he's saying to his son in the faith, he's saying, Timothy, do it well. Because it's so great to get to the end of your life and be able to look back on your life and say, I did it right. I finished the race that God laid out for me. I kept the faith. I didn't back down. I didn't give up. I did what he wanted me to do. I was a good servant for him. I've done a lot of funerals, and some of them are a lot easier to do than others. I don't mean to be morbid this morning, but I think I've done enough funerals to where, for me, it's this. I want it to be that at the end of my life, somebody's able to stand up there and preach, and they're not just trying to figure out what's something good we can say about this guy. Wouldn't it be nice if they could say, man, here's a guy who fought the faith. Here's a guy who finished the race. Here's a guy who was faithful. And again, I don't mean to make this about me. I hope this is in the heart of every one of us. That we long to say with Paul, as I look back on my life, I see I did what God called me to do. I was a faithful servant. I did well with what was entrusted to me. But then that's him looking back. But then now notice he looks forward. And look at how awesome this is. Henceforth, he said, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness. I'm going to be rewarded for the life I lived, he says, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. Paul says, man, my life's going to be over pretty soon, but you know what? When I get to heaven, I get a reward from Jesus himself. But I love that he includes the next part. He says, and not only to me, but also to all who loved his appearing. What does that mean, to all who loved his appearing? What does that mean, loved his appearing? I think it means this. Think about this parable. Who in this parable loved the appearing of their master? The first servant loved it. He looked forward to it. I cannot wait till my master gets back. Because it's like report card time, right? Some students love report card time. I can't wait. Because I get to sit down with mom and dad sitting across from my teacher, and my teacher's going to go, man, they're just a joy to have in class, and they just work really hard, and they've done really well. As a child, I did not experience very many of those. I did not love the appearing of my conferences. I was like, oh, here we go again, you know. But in this parable, the first servant, he loved his master's appearing. He couldn't wait for him to get back so he could run up and say, Master, guess what I did? And the second servant the same way. Lord, look what we did for you. Master, look what we accomplished. Of course, the third one breaks the pattern. Isn't it interesting? As I read through the story again and kind of digging it apart a little bit, it's interesting to me that this third servant, we see it in verse 24, when the master comes back, he starts accusing the master. Right? Look at verse 24 again. It says, he also who received 1 talent came forward saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man. Right? That's how he starts. He doesn't start with what he did or didn't do. He starts with, you're really hard to work for. You're rough. You're harsh. You're hard to please. And he goes on and tells why he's so hard to please. He says, you like reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. Man, you're hard to work with. You want fruit where you haven't planted any seed. Now I don't think he knew the master very well, if this is a picture of Jesus Christ. But I think it's just an empty excuse. It's just an excuse that rings hollow. It wasn't really about that. He was just trying to defend himself. He was just trying to get the blame off of him. But boy, isn't this the worldly attitude toward God? Why should I do anything for God? I'm my own person. I own me. I own my body. I get to be who I want. I get to think what I want. I get to do what I want. It's a denial of the fact that God is the one who gifted us with all these things. Why should God gain from my labor? Why does he want to gather fruit where he hadn't planted any seed? That's not right. Why should I give anything to him? That's the attitude of this third servant. And then he justifies himself in the end by saying, well, here, take back what's yours. Don't worry, I still have it. I'll dig it back up, and here you go. Here's what you started with. And just like the master commended the character of the first two, he condemns the character of the third one. Notice he doesn't even beat the guy up about it. He doesn't say, what, one? He says, your character, you're wicked and slothful. You didn't do anything for me. Even if what you says about me is true. I love how he goes, okay, even if the accusation was true, If I was hard to please and I like getting what I don't deserve, then wouldn't it have at least made sense to go put the money in the bank? I would have at least had interest. I mean, their banking system was similar to ours. Wouldn't it make sense then? If you're so worried about, I'm such a hard guy to work with, why don't you put it in the bank and earn some interest? But see, I don't think that's the issue at all. He's saying the issue is that you're wicked and slothful. The issue is you didn't want to do anything for me because you're not a faithful servant. Now, I do think it's important to note here that the servant's guilt is not that he did some horrible thing. It's not that he stole the master's money. It's not that he ran off and spent it on something else. Here he's condemned not for what he did, but really for what he didn't do. That was the problem is what he didn't do anything for his master. Whatever he did with his life from the time his master left to the time his master came back, he just lived for himself. He did not serve his master. So his end is pretty dramatic, right? He loses the talent. He gets thrown into outer darkness. But what are we to learn from this third servant? Who does he represent here? You know, there are some commentators who say, well, this guy represents a Christian who just never lived for the Lord. So in the end, you know, he went to the judgment seat of Christ. It was pretty harsh. I just can't buy that. There's a lot of other commentators, I agree with them, who say, no, this is a guy who was never really a believer. There's a couple reasons I think that's the right interpretation. One reason is because this talk of, look at verse 30. He cast the worthless servant in the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Those phrases are often used throughout the New Testament to describe hell. Let me throw one in for free. If you look at chapter 25, kind of back up and look at all of it, there's 3 stories in chapter 25. All 3 of them have to do with pictures of Jesus saying, I'm going to leave and I'm going to come back. I'm going to leave. He describes it 3 different ways. In the first one, the parable of the 10 virgins, he comes back, 5 are ready and 5 aren't. And the one who aren't, he says, I don't know you, right? Believers and unbelievers. In the third story, where it talks about the final judgment, Jesus says, I'm going to come back like a shepherd, separating the sheep from the goats. These guys are saved. These guys aren't saved. And so I think it fits the pattern that the middle parable has the same kind of conclusion. He says, look, I'm going to come back, and some are going to be faithful and going to come on into heaven, some of them weren't. But wait a minute. But it says here that they were a servant of the master. Doesn't that seem to imply that it was somebody who knew the Lord? Let me tell you what I think it means. I think it means, and to me this is a little bit scary, I think it means this third servant is somebody who claimed to be a servant of the master but wasn't really. In other words, I think he symbolizes a professing believer who's really not a believer. Can I tell you, and again, I don't mean to be heavy, I really don't, but sometimes we have to remember this. There are a whole lot of people in the world who describe themselves as Christians who are not born again. And you see through the pattern of their life, the way they live out their life, there's just no fruit there. And you got to go, It's not our place to decide who's saved and who's not. That's his job. But it is our job to evaluate ourselves. It is our job to look at ourselves and say, am I somebody who just says I'm a Christian, or am I a Christian? Am I somebody who sees by the desire of my life, the desire of my heart? And it's a tricky business, isn't it? It's a tricky business because all of us, even though we are truly born again, still struggle with sin. So, well, that's not the measure. All of us, even though we truly are born again, still have times when we backslide, times we're not living for the Lord the way we should. It's a tricky business. But if you prayed some prayer, 10 years ago, and you see no fruit in your life serving the master, if you relate more to the third guy than the first guy or the second guy, you have to say, man, I've got to make sure I'm really born again. That I really know the Lord. That I really have a heart that says, man, I want to do something for my master. I want to be very clear. We are not saved by works. But if we are truly saved, we will work. If we're truly saved, there's something in us that's going to want to serve the master. The Life Application Commentary says it this way. I thought this was helpful. He says, to fail to do good with what God has entrusted to us, to fail to use it to increase his kingdom is a grievous sin that will receive severe punishment, for it means that one never knew or loved the master. He goes, sometimes you got to look at your life and go, if I'm not sure I'm saved, it might be because I'm not. John MacArthur put it a little more succinctly. He said, saving faith is serving faith. We're not saved by serving the master, but if we're truly saved, we'll want to serve the master. There'll at least be some of us, something in us that says, man, I want to please the Lord while he's gone. I want to be ready for when he gets back. So how do we really embrace this idea of stewardship? I think it's when we realize stewardship is about ownership. Stewardship is about ownership. Who owns it? If you have a talent, who owns that talent? Do you own it because you have it? Or does he own it and he's entrusted it to you? Because if I own it, I can do what I want with it, right? If I own it, it's up to me. I can do anything I want. I own it. It's mine. Whether it's a skill, ability, money, opportunity. Again, I think it's very broad here, the application. Anything I possess, anything I have influence over, is it mine or is it his? If I own it, I can do what I want. You know, I've told you guys, Grace and I recently bought that house a few blocks away here. I love it. I love standing in my front yard and saying, hey, there's the church. I love it. I love being that close to the place. But it's so interesting that before we bought that house, you know what we could do to that house? Nothing. And when we were getting ready to buy the house, and we knew pretty soon we were going to own it, Grace and I, we were pathetic because we drove by that house every day. We just did. We're driving by, we're talking about it, we're looking at it every day. But we can't do anything. We couldn't even walk through the door without permission. But now we own it. And now that we own it, we can do anything we want. We paint stuff, we move furniture around, we do laundry. I mean, we do everything. It's amazing. We own the house, right? But it'd be weird. It'd be weird if one day I got done with work, I went home, and I walked in, and the old owners were there, changing out light fixtures and remodeling the kitchen. You know what I mean? Wait. You don't own this place anymore, right? How can you, what are you doing? That would be weird because they're not the owners anymore. When you came to Christ, you gave ownership to him. And let me say it even, I think, more theologically correct. When you came to Christ, you recognized his ownership of it. He already owns us because he created us. And even though he created us, he owned us, we rejected him, and in our sin, he came and bought us back again. When we came to Christ, we recognized his ownership of us. And that's why Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 6, listen to this. He says, do you not know your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? Listen to these words. You are not your own. Do we really believe that? I'm not mine. I don't get to live however I want, do whatever I want, think whatever I want. But I serve a master. He says, you are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. We are under new ownership. And that is such good news. Because the new owner knows so much better how to live your life than you do. He does. And the good news is we don't have an owner who is a heavy owner who just wants to put his foot on our neck. We have an owner who loves us. We have an owner who cares about us. We have an owner who says, you are my servant. And there is no better place to be in the world than to be in good connection with that master. He's not, masters, they're harsh masters. We don't have one. Our master is a kind, loving master. But let's not get it confused. He's not the servant. He's the master. And we live our lives for him. So let's work hard in the short time we have. So that when Jesus comes back and it's time to settle accounts, won't it be wonderful if he can say to you, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little bit. I'm going to set you over much. Come on in, enter the joy of your master. I hope that's the story for every single one of us in this room. That when Jesus comes back to settle accounts, that's what we get to hear. Amen. Let's go ahead and close the word of prayer together. Our Father in heaven, we bow before you and we thank you, Lord, for all that you've given us. And I pray, Father, that you would help us, Lord, help us in those times when we get twisted around, because I think we all struggle with this. We all forget sometimes that what we have is yours. Sometimes we forget that we are yours. Sometimes we forget our stuff is yours. Sometimes we forget our talents, our abilities are yours. So, Father, I pray that you would stretch us in this area. Help us to grow in this area. And Lord, I want to pause for a moment, just thank you and praise you. There are so many people in this church I know who already live this kind of life. They live a life of surrender to you. They live a life of service to you, Lord. I praise you for that. And Lord, all of us, I feel like, are on that scale somewhere. All of us need to grow in that area. I pray you'd help us with that. Help us to be faithful stewards to you. Lord, help us to be able to, like Paul said, that we can love your appearing. We can't wait for you to come back because we know you're going to be able to tell us well done. Help us to live our lives well for you. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.